Hey, what's up everyone? This is Mike for Kickstartpoker.com, and in this video I'm going to do a hand history review for one of my subscribers, in this case Boost. And I really like doing these hand history reviews because it's a great opportunity to learn. If you're a beginner player, if you're just starting out, if you want to improve your game, then it's really worthwhile to watch these kinds of hand history reviews because you can really learn a lot from them. And I'm just going to go over the tournament and point out the things that you're doing correctly, the things that you're doing wrong, the potential leaks that you may have, and the things that you need to work on to improve your game. And that's really useful for other players as well to see if they have similar leaks in their game. Okay, I'm just going to go over the hands in this tournament. This is a 9-man non-turbo sit-and-go played on America's Card Room, and the buy-in is $1.50. So it's a low-stakes, micro-stakes tournament. Okay, so the first hand you pick up ace-10 offsuit. The guy next to you limps in for 20 chips, and you raise to 40 chips. I think this is a definite mistake. With ace-10 offsuit, this is a hand that I usually do not play at the early stage of the game. It's only 10-20. There's a limper ahead of you. Ace-10 offsuit is not really good enough to get involved here, so I would usually just fold here. Also, because this is the first hand of the game, you don't have usually any information on your opponents, so you're just using those first stages to see what your opponents are doing, how they are playing, what their stats are, and all that sort of stuff. So the first stage of the game, 10-20, you really shouldn't be looking to get involved in a lot of pots, and you need a stronger hand than ace-10 offsuit to get involved because the chips aren't really worth winning now, and you really should focus on the stronger hands. So if you are going to raise, 40 is definitely not enough, because if you have a hand like ace-10 offsuit, you really want to raise a little bit more to dissuade other people behind you to come along as well. But if you just make a min raise to 40 chips, you're giving excellent pot odds to the players behind you, especially the players in the blinds, who only have to call another 30 and another 20 chips to get along. But also the other players are getting really good pot odds. So if you're only raising to 40 here, you're going to see a lot of calls behind you usually, especially in low stakes games where play tends to be very passive. So you're usually going to see quite a few calls behind you. And with ace-10, you don't really want to play a multi-way pot because the more players are in the pot, the more the equity of your hand goes down. So ace-10 offsuit against one player is a pretty good hand, but against 3, 4, 5 players, it's really not that good. So yeah, as I said, I would usually just fold here, and if you're gonna raise, then you should raise to like at least 80 to not give the players behind you such good pot odds. So what happens, this guy calls along as well, and as you can see, he's getting 2.25 to 1, so he's getting great pot odds, and when he calls, the one after him will get even better pot odds. So in this case, the button folds, even though he was getting great odds. And the small blind in this case is getting 4.33 to 1. He only needs to call another 30 to get involved. So he's probably going to call. Yes, he does. Then the big blind, he's getting 8 to 1. He only has to call another 20. So he's getting involved as well. And then Vendetta, the initial limper, he's getting 9 to 1 pot odds. So, with these pot odds, they should really call with any two cards because they only have to invest a very small number of chips for a potential big pot. So when you make such a small raise over a limper, you're going to see this very frequently, that you're going to get a lot of calls. And this is really not what you want. So the initial limper calls as well, and you go 5-way to the flop. The flop is queen 8-9, 2 diamonds. With ace-10, it's really a bad hand. You have ace high, but there are so many draws out there. There's like flush draws, straight draw, the queen X, and a lot of players like to call with the hands in the range of the Jack 10, Queen 10, Queen Jack, those sorts of hands. So your hand really doesn't look that good. You do have a gut shot, but that's a really weak hand to have here. So let's see what happens. We get 2 checks, and the initial limper bets 20 into 200. That's a very, very small bet. And with that price, I guess you have to call because, you're getting 11 to 1, even though you only have a gut shot in ace high, yeah. I really don't think it's that really worth it, but for only 20 chips, you really can't fold, I guess. So you do make the call. We get all the other players calling as well. And then the turn is the 8 of spades. The board pairs, now there's two potential flush draws out there. You really still don't have a hand, so I think we should just give up here, and let's see what happens. Okay, so this guy bets another 20. Even though it's only 20 chips, it's very unlikely that you're going to win the hand by showdown. And trying to bluff here is really not something that you should do, given that you are with multiple players in the pot and the board is looking pretty dangerous. So I think a fold is probably best here. And you do. And in the end, this guy had pocket jacks. So right off the bat, we're also trying to look for how our opponents are playing. And so this guy is really, really passive. He just limped pre-flop for 20 chips with pocket jacks. That's very passive. That's a good hand that you should definitely raise. And then he played it very passively as well, because he just you made the min raise. He just called pre-flop. And then he makes these very small bets post-flop with pocket jacks when he sees one overcard to his pair. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, and we're keeping an eye on that player, how he plays, to get some reads as we go along. Deuce 8 offsuit, a really bad hand, and you fold, so that's great. And then ace king under the gun +1. You raise it up to 50. I think that's fine. Personally, I would raise a little bit more, simply because we're in a not such a great position. We're under the gun +1, and we don't really want a lot of callers behind us. So I would usually just raise to 60 here, but 50 is also fine. We're getting one call. The button calls, small blind calls, and we see a flop of 9-3-8, with the pot being 220. It gets checked to us, and it's a bit tricky, I think. I mean, we do have ace king, we do have two overcards, we missed a flop here. We could make a continuation bet, definitely, but there are three other players in the pot now. And looking at their stats, these players are very, very passive. If you look at their aggression factor, the DMB 2381 guy has a 1.1 aggression factor. The other guy has a 0.7. The Kings 4202 has 0.0. And they are very loose and passive by the looks of it. So if you make a continuation bet into three players on a board where you completely missed, it's going to be very tough to make them fold. I can pretty much guarantee that, if you make a continuation bet, you're going to see at least one call, and probably you're going to see two calls. So that's going to be a little bit tricky in this situation. Now, personally, I think maybe checking against these specific types of players is the best thing that you can do here. Also, because if you check, it's very unlikely that your opponents are going to bet if they have absolutely nothing. They're not going to bet with ace jack or ace 10, probably, because they're very passive. So if they're going to bet, they're usually just going to bet with a made hand, so a pair that they made on this flop. You actually make a continuation bet. I don't think that's a really bad thing to do. Making continuation bet is standard in a way, but in this particular spot, against these types of opponents, three very passive opponents, I would usually just check and play a little bit safe. As to your bet sizing, I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, if you're betting into three players, you shouldn't really make very small bets, because you're giving them great pot odds, and a little over half the pot seems pretty decent and will sometimes get the job done. But against these passive players, it's very unlikely that you will actually make all of them fold. We get one call and two folds. All right, so we're going to the turn, which is the 9 of diamonds. Now that you made a continuation bet on the flop, the board pairs. If he had a hand that he was willing to call with on the flop, he's probably going to call on the turn as well. He's very passive, so he's unlikely to make a bet himself if you check. So given those circumstances, I would just check here and see what develops, which you do, and he checks behind. And the river is another 9. So there are 3 9s on board now, and it's quite likely, to be honest, that your ace high is good now, and you make a bet of 120. And I actually quite like this bet, because we're playing against a very passive player. If he also has ace high, he's probably going to call us. And even if he has king high or queen high or maybe even jack high, there's a good chance that he's just going to call us. You know, against these passive players, you really want to make a lot of value bets, even on boards like these, when it's quite likely that you actually have the best hand. And 120 is also a good bet size because if he has ace high or king high, he's probably not going to call a lot of chips. So, you know, if you bet like 200 or 230, 250, he's going to fold most of the time. But if you make this small bet, 120 to 460, I think there's a decent chance that he's going to call with those hands like ace high and king high. But in this case, he just folds, so he probably didn't have anything. But yeah, as I said, I really like the bet size on the end there. 9-8 offsuit, you fold, and I think that's perfectly fine. You do have a connected hand, but you're under the gun, so not really worth playing. 10-3 off. Just check behind and go in check fold mode, usually if you don't hit anything. We do have an open-ended straight draw, but it's the dummy end of the straight, so it's not really worth getting excited about. So let's see what happens. Queen on the turn, and this guy bets 60. Yeah, just get out of the way. It's not really worth continuing in the hand. So you fold, and that's good. 5-8. You actually fold here, but I think you should really call simply because looking at the pot odds, you're getting 11-1 pot odds, which are really great pot odds. And as you see, you only need equity of 8% to actually call here. Basically, you're getting such great pot odds that you should call with almost any two cards. I would only consider folding if I had a really, really bad hand like deuce 3 or 7 deuce offsuit. But even with those hands, you probably get the correct pot odds to at least call. So, you know, even though you're out of position, you're just getting such a great price. And I think 5-8 suited in particular is really a hand that you should play here because it has quite a bit of potential. It's suited, it's somewhat connected, so you have flush and straight potential. And given the price that you're getting, you should definitely just call here. Ace queen suited, we get 1 limp, 2 limp, we get a raise. And this is really a bit of a difficult situation, I think, because the guy who's raising, again, you know, he's very loose and very passive. He has a VPIP of 48%, but only a pre-flop raise of 4% and an aggression factor of 0.5. So that really tells us that he is extremely passive and he very, very rarely raises. So when he raises here, I'm putting him on a very strong range. I think that's somewhere in the range of 10s plus, jacks plus, ace king, somewhere along them lines. And our hand doesn't, you know, we don't have a lot of equity against that range. So I'm not that very enthusiastic about this hand. 3 betting is out of the question because then we would have to raise to such an amount that we're getting pot committed. So the question is, are we going to call or are we going to fold? And to be honest, I'm leaning towards a fold. That might seem a little bit nitty because we do have ace queen suited and we're in position on the button. But just looking at the specific stats of this opponent, that he's so incredibly passive, I think that, you know, even if we flop an ace or if we flop a queen, we definitely can be sure that our hand is good. So I would just play it safe here against such a passive opponent raising. I personally think that it is better to just fold and get out of the way. You do make the call. I don't think it's horrible, to be honest. You know, ace queen suited is a good hand, but I prefer fold here. We get actually 2 calls, and well, we do have that flop of the ace high flop. Our hand could be good here. You know, our opponent, I think, when he is that passive and he's on such a tight range, you know, if he has a hand like pocket 10s or jacks or queens, then, you know, we have him crushed. The only thing we have to worry about a little bit is pocket aces and ace king. But mathematically, these are a little bit less likely because there's an ace and a king out there on the flop already. So our hand is looking pretty good. And we should still play it pretty safe because we don't really want to go broke on this board, you know. The pot is 470. That's already about 1/3 of our stack, and we really don't want to go broke here and potentially lose the tournament. So we're just going to play it safe and see what develops. You bet 60 chips. I think it's a little bit on the small side. I think you should bet more here because all our opponents checked, so they probably don't have anything. But they are relatively passive, and if you bet, there's a good chance that they're going to call. So with a hand like ace queen here, I think you should bet more for value. And you should also bet a little bit more for protection too, because if you're there's a good chance that your opponents are sitting there with either a flush draw or a gut shot straight draw, for example, with hands like 10 jack, queen jack, queen 10. And you really want to charge them for it. For value and protection, you should really bet a little bit more. I think betting 60 into 3 other players is not enough. And you should really bet something like 200 in this situation. I think that's about a good bet size that you can make. But let's see what our opponents do. We get one call. And the turn is the queen of diamonds. Okay, so there are 3 diamonds now on board. Our opponent checks. And you bet 250. I think that's a good bet. I mean, you're starting to bet a little bit more now, and that's good because the board is starting to look a little bit more scary. You have 2 pair now, and you really want to get some value from hands like a 10x, jack x for a gut shot, hands that have a single diamond for a flush draw. You also want to charge those hands. And also if he has a hand like a king x or ace x, you really want to get value from those hands as well. And he's probably going to call with those too because he's so passive. So I like this bet size. It's pretty good, and there's a good chance that we're going to get some value here. But our opponent actually folds, so it's quite likely that he actually did have a hand like pocket 10s or jacks, and he's just getting out of the way. Queen 5, even though you're getting great pot odds, just fold this one. 5-10, there's a raise, we're going to fold. 7-8, yeah, I would usually just fold here, especially in a game where your opponents are so passive. We do have a nice hand. You could also limp here. I don't mind that either simply because your opponents are so passive. If you limp, you're just going to see a bunch of limps behind you, and you get the opportunity to see a flop with a connected hand. So limping is also fine, but folding is perfectly fine as well. I don't mind that. So ace jack, you raise to 75. I like the raise size. Ace jack from the hijack position is definitely good enough to raise. We're gonna have to be a little bit more aggressive now that the blinds have gone up to 15-30. So yeah, I like that raise, ace jack offsuit, and I also like the raise size 75. Usually when it's 10-20, my default raise is about 3x, but when the blinds are going to go up, I'm going to go a little bit down to 2x, 2.5x, 2.75x, because you don't really need to raise as much anymore to dissuade other people from calling and to get that full equity. So 75 is a good raise size. You can also raise 90, that's fine as well. But 75, I quite like it. So everybody folds, and the big blind calls, and he has a pretty shallow stack of 500 chips. So we should be playing a little bit cautiously post flop because our opponent is quickly getting committed now, given the stack to pot ratio. The flop is jack 5-10, rainbow, so we have a pretty good hand with top pair, top kicker. Our opponent checks, and we definitely need to bet here because, again, our opponent is very passive. So against passive players, you really want to start betting as soon as you can. Start building those pots. If you have a good hand, just value bet and start value betting straight from the flop so you get the opportunity to win a lot of chips by the river. You bet 80 into 165. That's a perfect bet. I like it. When your opponent has a really shallow stack, like in this case 519 chips, and the pot is already 165, you don't really want to bet a whole lot because that's going to be looking very threatening to your opponent, and he's probably going to fold a lot of his hands. So in situations when the SPR is relatively low and your opponent does have a shallow stack, it's better to bet small on the smaller side. To get some value and not scare your opponent away. He actually calls. The turn is the deuce of spades. The board is really great for our hand still. Our opponent checks. And you bet 80 again. And I really think you should bet more now because you're betting small into a relatively big pot. So giving your opponent 5-1 pot odds, which is great. I mean, you're looking for that call, but I think you can get away with betting bigger. Because the pot is relatively big, so even if you bet a little bit more, your opponent is still getting good pot odds to call. And if he has a straight draw, if he has a flush draw, if he has 10x, if he has top pair with the worst kicker, then he's just going to call. So you really need to bet a little bit more to get some extra value. And I think you should bet at least 100, somewhere around that range, 100, 120, I think you can get away with. So I think 80 is too small here. Our opponent actually folds, so he probably didn't have anything, but that's, irrelevant. We're targeting his value range, and against his value range, we could have bet a little bit more in order to get some calls from those hands. But other than that, I think you played this hand pretty well. Ace King offsuit, we have a slightly worse position than the Ace Jack in the previous hand. We're under the gun +1 now, and you raised to 90 chips, which I think is fine. If you have really bad position, it's usually better to raise a little bit more. So the last hand you raised 75, and I think it's fine to raise to 90 now. We get 2 callers, and the flop is Queen 4 deuce, 2 clubs. We do have the King of clubs. So we have a backdoor king high flush draw and 2 overcards. And of course also a backdoor straight draw, but that's not really helping us all that much. So we get 1 check, and you check as well. I quite like making continuation bet here because in this case we only have 2 opponents to worry about. So with 2 opponents there's a little bit less of a chance that either one of them has a good hand. And also the pots are getting bigger now. The pot is 285, which is really worth winning now. So, we have to play a little bit more aggressively when the blinds go up and when the pots are getting bigger. Then we have to start being a little bit more aggressive. And as we saw, we do have a little bit of equity with 2 overcards and a backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. And I think we have to be a little bit more aggressive. So personally, I would usually just continuation bet here, even though these 2 opponents are very passive. Okay, so everybody checks now. The turn is the Jack of spades. And now you bet 75. I'm not too sure about that because the Jack just peeled off. There's a chance that either one of our opponents just hit that card. And why are we betting now on a turn? We're trying to tell a story to our opponents. And why would we check the flop with a hand like, for example, Queen X or pocket kings or pocket aces? We would probably just bet there, right? So it's a bit strange to just delay that continuation bet to the turn, and we still don't have anything. We still have 2 overcards, and we pick up a gut shot now, but we don't have that much equity. So I'm not really that convinced about the story that you're telling to your opponents and whether you can actually make them fold. I think that with these passive opponents, and you're making also a pretty small bet, I think you're going to see at least 1 call, and that's going to be problematic going to the river because, if you miss the river, which is going to happen quite frequently, are you going to bet again against a passive opponent? He's probably just going to call again, and it's quite unlikely that you have the best hand. So I'm not too enthusiastic about delaying the continuation bet to the turn. I think if you're playing this hand aggressively, it's much better to just bet the flop. And as played, if the flop checks through, on this turn, I would usually just check as well and see what happens. You get 1 call, and the river is the Jack of clubs. So the flush draw gets there. If our opponent had a Jack, he just made trips. And you actually bet 100. And you have to ask yourself what you're really trying to accomplish here. Are you trying to accomplish that he's calling you with a worse ace? Maybe you can get him to call with a worse ace, maybe king high, but it's really a long shot. And I think that given his entire calling range, I don't see that many hands that he's going to call that are worse than yours. So, is this a value bet? Is this a bluff? Our opponent calls, and he actually shows 10 jacks. So yeah, I mean, this wasn't the best hand that you played. I think you should continuation bet the flop and play it a little bit more aggressively. And you shouldn't, start betting on the turn and river when there's a good chance that you're actually beat and you're not getting any value from worse hands. 7-10, that's a fold. King deuce, we're just going to check behind. We flop nothing, so we're usually going to go in check fold mode unless we improve. Ace-6, you complete. I think that's perfectly fine. Our hand is too weak to raise here. We're out of position. The guy open limping has a pretty shallow stack, so we got to be careful. We do flop an ace and you bet 45. I really like this. We have top pair. It's not very likely that either one of our opponents has an ace, even though the one open limping definitely could have an ace simply because he's so passive. So there's still a good chance that he's limping his weak aces there. The big blind, he can also have an ace. But there are tons of other hands that can, pay you off. There's a flush draw out there. There are potential gut shots out there. 10x hands are probably going to call. So there are quite a few hands in your opponent's ranges that can call here. And you also need to protect against a flush draw and straight draw. And and both of your opponents fold, so that's a good result, and you take it down. Queen 5, even though you're getting 4.5 to 1, you know, it's such a bad hand, and I would just fold that, and you do that. Perfect. King Jack and Vendetta limps again. He does that very frequently, and you make a min raise again. And personally, I don't really like those min raises over a limp, because as I explained before, you're giving your opponents, I mean, the guy who limped, he's getting great pot odds to call, but you're also giving your opponents behind you, especially your opponents in the blinds, very good pot odds to come along as well. And that's not really what you want. You want, with a hand like King Jack, you want to thin the field, you want to be up against one opponent maximum. So you have the best chance to actually take down the pot. So if you're going to raise, I think you should raise more to like 120. That's a much better raise size. You're often getting the blinds out of the way, and you can get a heads up against the limper and go from there. But I do like the raise. I mean, a fold is fine as well. A limp behind even is not that horrible, simply because the table is so passive. So I wouldn't mind that either. But if you're going to raise a little bit more. So he flops second pair on a board that is looking pretty dangerous with straight and flush possibilities. I think we should definitely bet here, because we took the lead pre-flop, even though it was only with a min raise, and we have second pair. Our hand is often going to be good, and the pot is really worth winning now. There's 210 in the middle, and that's about 10% of our stack, so that's a great spot to make a continuation bet. You bet 55 into 210. It's a pretty small bet, and in general, you know, I would tend to bet a little bit more, especially on a wet board like this. You know, default c-bet sizes would be something like 50% of the pot, between 40 and 60% of the pot. And this is quite small. I mean, you're really inviting players to come along. If someone has a straight draw, if someone has a flush draw, he's just going to call because you're making it so cheap. And you really, you know, you don't necessarily want these hands in and giving them a great price to come along for the ride. So you really want to take that pot down, because it's already 210 chips. So you don't really mind just taking it down right away on the flop. So I would personally bet a little bit more to get value from your hand and to protect your hand as well against possible straight and flush draws. The small blind calls, the other guy calls as well, and then the turn is the 9 of spades, which is not the greatest card. King 10 just got there, and the flush gets there as well. Our hand may still be good. We do pick up a jack high flush draw, so that's nice. We get 2 checks, and you bet another very small amount. You know, with these opponents, they're very passive. I don't really mind such a small bet on a turn, because we have a pretty marginal hand, and we don't really want to invest a lot of chips. And I think checking behind is fine as well. But if you're going to bet, you know, against these types of opponents, you usually should bet on the smaller side, given that we have a pretty weak hand at the moment, and we don't really want to invest a whole lot more chips. But our hand does look face up. You know, if we make such a small bet, it looks like we're not comfortable with our hand. It looks like we're pretty weak. So if you're playing against better opponents, this is, you know, really not something that you should do. But against very bad recreational beginning players that are very passive, I think you can get away with such a very small value bet and see what develops. But, you know, in general, I would tend to just check behind and see what the river brings, given that we have a pretty marginal hand on a scary board with 2 opponents that are showing some interest in the pot. So I would prefer a check here. We get 2 calls. The river is the 5 of hearts, and our opponent leads out for 30 chips. We're getting such a great price here of 20.5 to 1. I mean, you know, we really have to call with that pair of jacks here. And I'm not really sure what Riffy Cat is doing that with here, betting so small on the river. Maybe he missed his draw and he's trying to make some kind of a blocking bet. I'm not sure. But, you know, for 30 chips, we really have to call, which we do. And our opponent shows up with ace 10. So his small bet on the river actually was a missed draw. He picked up an ace high flush draw on the turn. He had a gut shot as well, and he missed on the river, and he just made this small bet. So from his part, you know, a pretty poorly played hand. But you're going to see these plays often in these micro stakes games. King 9, you fold. That's fine. Ace 10. Again, you do the same thing. Someone limps and you make a min raise. You know, personally, I don't really like that all that much. But given the fact that the blinds have gone up to 25-50, It's actually not that bad because the pots are going to be bigger, the blinds are really worth winning now, and raise sizes pre-flop are going to be smaller. So as far as that's concerned, I don't really mind going here for a min raise. Also because the one open limping only has a stack of 700 chips behind, so he's getting a little bit short. So you don't really want to raise too much and really pot commit your opponent if he calls. So as far as that's concerned, I don't really mind going with the min raise here. We get a min 3-bet to 150. The initial limper folds, and I think we should just call here. We're not really thrilled about this situation because, again, this opponent is very passive, and when he makes a min 3-bet, he's usually going to have a pretty strong hand. But with 7.5 to 1 pot odds, we really can't fold for those extra 50 chips. So we're just going to have to call and see what happens. We flop top pair, top kicker, but the board is very dangerous with 3 clubs, and it's also very connected. So there's plenty of straight draws and flush draws out there. And I think we should definitely bet here because we don't really want to be in a situation where we check and our opponent checks behind, because in that case, we're giving him a free card to improve. Our hand is often going to be good, but it's very vulnerable to turn and river cards. So we really want to bet here for value as well as protection. You bet 210, I think that's perfectly fine. Around half the pot, that's pretty standard, and our opponent folds. So that's a good result, and we pick up the pot. 7-5, you fold, that's fine. King 6. You make a min raise here to 100, and I'm not really sure why you do that. That may have been a misclick, because I really don't understand why you would make a min raise here with 7-3 suited. So I assume it's a misclick or something, but But in general, I definitely wouldn't do that here with a weak hand out of position. Your opponent calls, check, bet, and fold. So I presume that was just a misclick. But in general, you shouldn't be min-raising out of position over a limp with weak hands like that. Jack 3, you're getting great pot odds of 5 to 1, but Jack 3 is pretty horrible, so I don't mind the fold. Jack 6, fold. Jack 10, you fold, and I think you can also call or make a small raise, but I don't mind the fold because our opponent open limping has only 600 chips, so a little over 10 big blinds. King Queen offsuit in the hijack position, that's fine to make a min raise. We get one call, we get another call, and we missed a flop with 375, and the pot is 325. Our opponent checks, and you make a very, very small continuation bet. I think you should definitely bet a little bit more because against 2 opponents, the pot is worth winning. We really want to play a little bit more aggressively. We're getting towards the later stages of the game. We want to pick up the aggression. We really want to take down those pots. And with only betting 50 into 325, you're giving your opponent such great pot odds. And I really think you should bet a little bit more to get them out of the way. So I think a continuation bet of between 100 and 150 seems about right. And I think 50 is too small here. You get one call, the turn is the 9 of diamonds. And now you decide to check, which, yeah, I guess that makes sense. You have king high. And our opponent Vendetta is very passive, so if we're going to bet again, it's very, very likely that he's just going to call again. The turn is the 4 of diamonds, and he actually bets 50, and you decide to call. I think there's a good chance that we're beat here simply because our opponent is so passive. So when he makes that bet on the river of only 50 into 425, I think there's a decent chance that we're beat. On the other hand, we're getting very good pot odds of 9.5 to 1. We do have king high, and also we get a little bit of information, which is also very nice to have. If we can see what our opponent is doing this with, we can use that for future hands. So that's also worth something. And with only 50 chips to call for a pot of 475, we're getting a very good price. And even though we won't have the best hand a lot of the times, the information is also worth getting. So I don't mind the call here. And he actually has ace 4, so that's worth noting. And if you see him do that, make a note of that in your head or in your poker software, the kinds of hands that he's playing and the kinds of bets that he's making with these sorts of value hands. Deuce 4, I like the bet on the river. You do have a pair of fours, so that might be good, and your opponent hasn't shown any interest in the pot so far. So if you bet 100, you know, maybe he's going to call with ace high or king high, who knows. It's not super likely maybe, but, you know, I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that you have the best hand the majority of the time. So I like the value bet, and your opponent actually folds. 10-6, you do get 5-1, but it's a pretty crummy hand, so I don't mind the fold. Ace 3, another limp. You know, ace 3 is not the best hand, so I don't mind the fold. 10-7. 10-7, I think you can definitely consider raising here. You've been playing relatively tight, and 10-7 suited is a good hand to raise here. You are in the cutoff, you have a relatively good position, you have a decent stack of 25 big blinds, and when the blinds go up, you have to be a little bit more aggressive, and this seems like a perfect spot to just open raise. Also, considering that the big blind has a pretty high fold to steal percentage. He's folding to steals from the small blind 75% of the time and from the big blind 100% of the time. It's a small sample size, that's true, but it seems that he's playing very cautiously out of position and is often folding to steals. So this seems like a very good spot to just open raise and steal, and 10-7 suited is a decent hand to do so. So I think you missed a spot here. Ace 8, you fold, but I think, you know, you can definitely raise here for the same reasons. You've been playing pretty tight so far. The blinds have gone up. Be a little bit more aggressive. And ace 8 offsuit from this position, with 5 players remaining at the table, you can definitely just open raise here. A fold is fine as well, but, you know, look for those spots to be a little bit more aggressive and make some steal raises. 5-6, we're going to just check behind and fold on the flop. That's fine. 6-4 offsuit, you fold again. I think you can definitely just complete here because we're getting 5-1 pot odds. We have a semi-connected hand. We have a stack that we can afford to invest some chips here. So a fold is not terrible, but I would normally just complete here. And again, you min raise over a limper, and as I said, I'm not that enthusiastic about it. In the early stage of the game especially, you're giving your opponents way too good pot odds to make those min raises over limps. When the blinds are bigger, like in this case 5100, it's not as bad, because even with a min raise, you're still forcing your opponents to make a decision. And in this case, you know, the small blind only has 1000 chips, so he only has 10 big blinds left. So in this case, it's not really the worst thing to do to make such a small min raise. I don't really mind it when the blinds get a little bit bigger, but in general, I would usually just raise a little bit more to prevent other players from coming along. But he folds, and the initial limper calls. The flop is 5-10-3 rainbow. Our opponent checks, and I think we should definitely make a continuation bet. 175 is fine. Personally, I would go a little bit more, probably like 200, just to get some more full equity. But our opponent folds, so that's a good result. Jack 10, and this Vendetta guy just keeps open limping all the time. I don't mind the fold. Jack 10 offsuit is not the greatest hand, so we're getting out of the way. 4-6, a fold. King 6. First is a button raise of a relatively tight player. We're just going to fold. 8-4 offsuit and you raise. And even though you have a very bad hand and your opponent only has around 10 big blinds, I don't really mind raising here because you've been pretty tight over the past couple of hands and you're showing some aggression now. Your opponent is also very tight, so there's a good chance he's just going to fold. You're only facing one opponent. So I like the idea that you're trying to be aggressive in these blind v blind situations, so that's good thinking. 8-4 offsuit is not the greatest hand, but I like the way that you're thinking here and trying to be aggressive and trying to steal those pots, especially against tight players in blind v blind situations. So that's good, and he actually shoves, and there's not much you can do here. You know, you try to make a cheap steal raise, it doesn't work, and we're just gonna have to fold. That's just how it works out sometimes. For deuce, we're gonna fold. Our opponent raises to 300, and we're in a pretty difficult situation because we have ace-9 suited, which is a pretty nice hand, but it's not really that good of a hand to start 3-betting in this situation with these stack sizes. So we're going to have to either fold or call, and I think a call is fine, even though we should be really, really careful because our opponent only has 8% pre-flop raise and a VPIP of 41%. So he's very, very picky as far as his pre-flop raises are concerned. He mostly just limps. And I think our ace-9 suited is not looking that good against that range. Plus, we're out of position as well. So in general, I would prefer folding here. A call is not horrible, but against this specific opponent, I prefer to fold here, out of position with this hand. We don't flop anything, he bets, and we're just going to have to fold even though we have 2 overcards and a backdoor flush draw. Against this specific opponent who is so passive and pretty tight as far as his raises is concerned, there's not really a reason for us to continue. But, you know, pre-flop, I would usually just fold there. A raise and a call, the guy open raising is very tight, and you fold. I personally don't mind that because we have a stack of around 13 big blinds left. So if we're going to play this hand, we have to shove, and king-queen offsuit is not good enough against a raise and a call from a pretty tight player. So he's probably going to just call us off if we shove most of the time, and we're going to be behind. So I like to fold here. Queen 5, this guy is just continuing to open limp. Never do that, especially at these blind levels. You know, you want to play aggressively. You don't want to be open limping all the time with these big blinds. So that's really not something that you want to do. Ace-jack off under the gun. That's a perfect hand to raise. I like the fact that you're min-raised because the blinds are getting big now. So you want to make these smaller pre-flop raises. That's perfectly fine. We get a shove. We get excellent pot odds, 2.4 to 1. So obviously we're just going to call. And that's nice. We win against king-queen suited. Queen 10, we get a walk. Ace-3 versus a cutoff raise from a very tight player. We're just going to fold. 6-3 suited, you fold, and I definitely would raise here because we have a pretty nice hand. We're in position. The blinds are really worth winning now. We have a stack that we can afford to make those steal raises. Plus, we're up against a player in the big blind who's folding to steals quite often. So this is a perfect hand to open raise with. We're four-handed, so we're on the bubble, so we really can apply a lot of pressure. So try to make more steal raises in these situations. You have to really play aggressively in the later stages of the game. Ace-3 offsuit, this time you raise, which is good. Trying to steal some pots here. Everybody folds, so you win the blinds. That's great. Jack 5 offsuit and you call. I would just fold here because our opponent is so tight. Jack 5 offsuit is a really bad hand, so I would just get out of the way and fold. There's really no reason to call a raise here out of position against a very tight player with such a bad hand. We do flop top pair, and you bet 675. I think that's way too big of a bet. Yes, we have top pair, and I think we should definitely consider betting here against a passive opponent on such a dangerous board with flush and straight possibilities. We do have top pair, so it's often going to be the best hand in this situation, even though definitely our opponent, given how tight he is, could also have a better hand than ours, like a better top pair, or maybe an overpair or a set. But 675 is really taking too much risk, because if our opponent comes over the top, we're just going to have to fold. I think we should bet, but really bet a lot smaller. Something like 300, 350 seems right. And 675 is just way too much in this situation. And our opponent does shove. He's going to have a better hand almost always, so we're pretty much forced to fold. And so that's the reason, you know, we shouldn't bet 675. It's way too much for the type of hand that we have. And if we face a situation that we get shoved on, you know, we just invested too many chips here to be able to make that play. So yeah, fold the Jack 5 offsuit pre-flop, and as played, since you called, make a much smaller bet on the flop here. You actually do call, and I think that's a clear mistake because against such an opponent, there's just no way that our hand is going to be good. Against some aggressive opponents, yes, they could be shoving with hands like Queen 10 or a flush draw. That's definitely a possibility. But against such a passive player who's not open raising that frequently, I mean, he has an 8% pre-flop raise percentage, so he has a pretty strong range, and he has only a 1.3% aggression factor. So when he's shoving, he's coming back over the top, he is raised pre-flop. There's just no way that we have the best hand here. So I think it's a clear mistake to call pre-flop. I also think it's a mistake to bet that much in the flop. 675, a pot size bet is not good. And then calling the shove is making things worse because there's a very small chance that we're actually good here. And our opponent had us crushed with King Jack, but you do get lucky by hitting a backdoor flush draw. But as said, this is a really poorly played hand, and if you get to the later stage of the game, it's important to keep that focus and play really well because you've come so far now, you're on the bubble of this tournament, and you really should do your best to make good decisions. And This really was a bad hand that you played, and you should really try to get those kinds of hands out of your game because they're going to cost you a lot of money in the long run. It works out in this case as you got very lucky, but this was a really poor hand that you played there. 10-5 off, and at this point I think we're in the money because 3 places are paid in this 9-man sit and go. Folding 10-5 off is fine. Ace King, a raise, everybody folds. 5-3, a tight player open raising the button, just fold that, that's fine. King deuce offsuit, and there you do it again, just make that min raise over a limp. I'm not that big of a fan in general, and as I said, when the blinds get higher, it's not that bad, but in this case with king deuce offsuit, it's a pretty bad hand. I would definitely not make the min raise here out of position, because your opponent is going to call and you're going to have to play the pot out of position. Yes, he is a short stack at the table, so you can put a lot of pressure on him, but he's very passive. So you're going to get yourself into trouble a lot of the time when you min raise over a limp like that with king deuce offsuit. You do get very lucky. You hit 2 pair, but king deuce offsuit is really not the hand that you should be doing that here with. You bet 150. I think that's fine. Against a passive player, it's good to start building that pot. You don't really want to bet too much because you have a really strong hand, and it's not very likely that your opponent has anything here now that you really have this board smashed. So I think that's fine to make a min bet here. Your opponent calls. You hit the jackpot on a turn with a full house, and you check here. And I think that's a clear mistake. You should really keep betting. Because your opponent is so passive, it's very likely that he's going to call again. There's a flush draw on board now as well. If he has 2 hearts, he's probably going to call. There's a lot of other hands that he's going to call with, like straight draws, ace highs, deuce X, 6X. Against a passive opponent, you really want to get value, and that's what you should really do here. So I would just make another very small bet, like between 150 and 300, and hope that he calls. A passive player like this is usually just going to check behind, and then you're just going to miss out on some value. So I would definitely just bet here again. Our opponent checks. The river is the 8 of clubs, and you bet 525 on the river. Obviously, you should bet here full house here on the river. And I think 525 is fine. Maybe he has something that he's going to call you with. He actually does. And the replayer doesn't show what kind of hand he had, unfortunately, but he did get some value there. 5-6 offsuit. Usually that's a good hand to still raise with here. However, the big blind is pretty short. He's under 10 big blinds right now, and he's very loose passive, so I don't mind to just fold, which you do. 10 deuce offsuit, and you actually fold here. And I think this is also something that you need to work on, because this is a perfect spot to open raise and try to steal the blinds. You really have a commanding position here with 7,000 chips. The person in the big blind has 4,500, and you can really use the short stack on the button as leverage versus the big blind. The big blind is really in a situation that he doesn't want to get involved with the big stack. There's a guy with 1,500 chips at the table, and he really doesn't want to bust out first. So you can put a tremendous amount of pressure on the big blind. In this case, as we have seen, the big blind is playing very cautiously. He's very cautious out of position. He's folding a lot to steal raises. And this is a perfect spot to be aggressive. And regardless of the hand that you have, 10 deuce offsuit is one of the worst hands that you can have, obviously. But the situation is so good that you really need to start playing a lot more aggressively here and open raise. You're just going to pick up the blinds so frequently here. And if you are the big stack, you should really use that position and be very aggressive, especially towards the middle stack. Queen Jack, you open raise, that's good. It's a quality hand, 3-handed on the button, so that's perfect. The big blind calls. You make a continuation bet of 150, I think that's fine. The big blind is starting to get short with 1,200 chips, so you don't really need to bet a whole lot. Your opponent calls. The turn is the 9 of diamonds. It goes check, check. Against this particular opponent, I don't mind checking behind simply because he's so passive and it's very unlikely that we're going to get him to fold if we bet again. But against most other opponents, I would definitely consider double barreling here on this turn. The river is the ace, and our opponent goes all in. Obviously, we're not going to call here because I think it's quite likely that our opponent has something. And to be honest, I think it's pretty likely that he has an ace here as well, simply because he overshoves the pot. He's so passive. So when he does make this big bet here, I think he has to have it, right? So I think there's a very good chance he has an ace. Maybe he has a full house. You know, at least he has a pretty strong hand, and obviously with queen high, we can't call there. And you actually do make the call, and I think that's a clear mistake. Again, maybe it's a misclick or something. I'm not sure, but you really have to pay attention more in the later stage of the game. You're getting maybe a little bit impatient. This is a really bad call. There's just no way that your queen high is good against a passive player just shoving the river here. So this is just a waste of chips. And our opponent indeed has ace-jack, so he has trip aces with a jack kicker. And he also picked up a flush draw on a turn, so he had a pretty massive hand, and he played it very passively, and then all of a sudden shoved on the river. So calling with queen-jack there is a clear mistake, and pay a little bit more attention in the later stage of the game, because this is a situation where you really have to make your best decisions. These are the decisions that count, and you should really work on being more focused and being more patient and making better decisions in the later stages of the game. For deuce, you do have a bottom pair, so I definitely think you can bet here, even though our opponent is very passive, so I don't mind just checking behind as well because the board is so dangerous. But you could just make a small bet here with your bottom pair, that's fine as well. It just checks all the way through. And then you shove all in on the river, and I have no clue why you would be doing that here, because you only have bottom pair. You're facing a very passive opponent, and even though, you know, it's very unlikely that your opponent actually has something because he just checked all the way down, but you're taking such a tremendous risk shoving all in for 3,000 chips effective stack size with such a marginal hand. I really don't see why you would be doing that. So again, this is a clear mistake. Maybe you're losing your patience. Maybe you're not focused enough, but that's really something that you should work on. These are really big mistakes that you're making. And there's just no way that a shove is ever going to be an optimal play here. King 5 suited. You could get involved and just complete here, or maybe even raise. You get out of the way, that's fine as well. Queen 5 offsuit, again, I think you should definitely take the opportunity to raise here because you've been playing pretty tight in these situations. And you are the chip leader at the table, so use the position as a chip leader and be aggressive in these blind v blind situations, especially against players who have shown that they are very reluctant to call out of position versus steal raises. So you missed one previously already, and that makes it a perfect spot to just open raise here. Don't really focus on your cards all that much in these situations, but play the position and play the player in these spots. Be more aggressive as a chip leader and take these opportunities to steal raise more frequently. Queen 10, you fold again, and I think this is a perfect spot again to open raise. You have a quality hand on the button. You have position. Queen 10 offsuit, I think you should definitely raise here. You're the chip leader, so be a little bit more aggressive and start raising more hands. 5-6 offsuit, and you fold again. So you miss another opportunity. You really have to be more aggressive in the later stages of the game, especially against players who are willing to give up their big blind frequently. So you're really missing some spots here, and you should be more aggressive. 6-8 offsuit, and you fold again. You know, you're just folding too many hands in a row, and you should really pick up the aggression, play a lot more aggressively as a chip leader, and especially when you have position on the button and when you're in blind v blind situations, you have to raise a lot more hands and steal the blinds. Queen 5, you fold here, and I don't mind that too much against this player because he's just so passive and he probably has a hand. On the other hand, I don't mind a call either. It's simply because you have a pair of 5s and you can just call and see what happens on the river. But I don't mind the fold either. Ace King, now you do make the raise, which is good. Your opponent folds. King 10, again, you make the raise, that's good. You bet 450, 50% of the pot with a good hand, top pair, and a king kicker, and you get the fold, so that's good. That's well played. Jack 9 suited, you raise, so finally you're starting to raise some hands. Everybody folds. Jack deuce suited, and finally you start making some raises, and I quite like that here. Because you've been so tight, because you've been folding a lot in these blind v blind situations, you're probably getting a lot of credit from your opponent, and he folds a lot to steals as well. So this is a great opportunity to steal raise. Your opponent folds. 7-8 suited. again, I think you should just raise here. It's a quality hand. The small blind is under 10 big blind, so there's a chance he's just going to shove. But again, you know, this opponent is very tight and cautious, so he's going to fold the majority of the time. And you just have to be aggressive, and especially with a hand like 7-8 suited in position, this is definitely a hand that you should open raise. There's not a lot we can do there, so just fold. Ace-6 offsuit and you min raise. I like the idea of just stealing the blinds here, but I think given that your opponent is under 10 big blinds, a shove is just the standard play here, because you have an ace blind versus blind, three-handed. You're the chip leader, you can put a lot of pressure on, and to put the maximum pressure on, a shove is just going to be optimal because your opponent is below 10 big blinds. So mostly you're in shove fold mode anyway, and a6 is more than good enough to shove here. So I would just shove in this spot. 10 jack offsuit and you're raising, that's good. We get a shove and you fold. And I think it's fine to fold here because our opponent is so tight, he's so cautious. So we're never going to be ahead with our 10 jack offsuit, and we're getting pot odds of 1.7 to 1. So these are not the greatest pot odds, and we have a commanding position in the tournament. We are the chip leader. There's not really a reason to just call off here and gamble. So I think a fold is good. Our opponents get all in, and the middle stack wins. So we're heads up now. A7 suited, again, you make the min raise. I think you should raise a little bit more, be more aggressive, especially when you're out of position. You don't necessarily want to play any hands out of position too frequently. So I think you should raise a little bit more to get that extra bit of full equity. And you have a quality hand as well. Heads up, A7 suited is a very strong hand. So also from the value perspective, I think you should just raise a little bit more here. We do pick up a nice hand. An ace-high flush draw and two overcards to the 5 and the 6, so that's a pretty good hand. You bet 800, which I think is too much because you're betting pot size. I don't know really what you're trying to accomplish here and what you're hoping that your opponent folds or calls with. I guess you're trying to make him fold. But you have to draw here. You know, you have a quality hand, you have a decent amount of equity, so I think a smaller bet of 400 is a much better bet size to make here. Your opponent calls, you miss on a turn, and you check. Against this opponent, I don't mind the check, because if you're going to be betting again against a very passive opponent, you're just going to likely build the pot. And if you miss the river, it's going to be hard to get him off the hand. It's just so hard to bluff against these passive opponents. So I don't mind being a little bit more cautious and check on the turn here. Your opponent checks as well. We miss on the river. Check again, that makes the most sense. I mean, why would you bet here on the river? So I think checking is the best play. And our opponent wins with a6, so that's a bit unfortunate, but that's how it goes sometimes. 10-5, you fold. Heads up, you have to be very aggressive from the button and play a lot of hands from the button, so if you're not going to raise, you should often limp from the button. But in this case, against such a very passive opponent, I don't mind folding a hand as weak as 10-5 offsuit here, so that's fine. 8-5 offsuit, that's good. You know, you're showing some aggression. It's not the best hand, but you have to be aggressive in heads-up situations, so that's fine. And you folded the last button, so your opponent will give you a little bit more credit once you raise now. Jack-3 offsuit, you call. I would usually just fold here against a passive opponent. Jack-3 offsuit is a pretty crummy hand. But let's see what develops. You totally miss. You check. He makes a continuation bet and you fold, so that's pretty standard. 8-3, you fold, that's fine. King-4 suited, that's a good hand to raise. Okay, so our opponent donk leads into King-7, Jack, 2 spades. The board is pretty dangerous, so I definitely think you have to raise. You make a min raise. I would personally raise a little bit more, simply because you have a good hand and you want to raise a little bit more for value. There's a good chance that your opponent is just leading out with, for example, a Jack X or 7X, or maybe a straight draw or a flush draw, and you really want to charge him for that. You know, your opponent is passive. Yeah, you really want to charge. If you have a good hand like top pair in this situation, you really want to charge him for trying to outdraw you. So you're really missing some value here if you just make the min raise. And I would personally go to like at least 500 or something like 600. That would be the optimal raise size. Our opponent calls. The turn is a 9 of hearts. You bet 800, half the pot, which I think is decent. You know, Queen 10 did get there for the straight, but there's not really a reason that we should be overly concerned about that yet. So we're just going to make a decent bet here and hope to get some extra value. Our opponent calls. The river is the Jack of Hearts. And on the river, our opponent leads out for 200. I'm not sure what that really means. He's a very passive player, so it could definitely mean that he just hit trip jacks on the river now. Maybe he has a straight. Maybe he has a strong top pair. It's really hard to tell against these passive players because they often play in such an erratic way, and it's really hard to put them on a specific hand range. So who knows what he has? But with 17 to 1 pot odds, obviously we're not going to fold. The question is, are we going to raise? And I think it's too thin to make the raise here because I don't see a lot of hands that are worse than ours that he's just going to call with if we make a value raise here. So I think a call is just a standard play here and see what he has. And he actually has pocket queens. So again, it's a bit of a strange way how he played that hand, but we already noticed that he's a very beginning and recreational player. He's not that good. He's way too loose passive, and he's making some weird plays here and there. So in this situation, we can take advantage of that and get some value from our hand. 9-10, and again you do the same thing. That's really a pattern. You always min raise when someone limps, or maybe you do that specifically against this opponent. Maybe you have some kind of dynamic with this opponent going on. I don't know about that, but you shouldn't be doing that so often with these min raises over the limps, especially when you're out of position, because your opponent is not going to fold. When you make that min raise, you're usually doing that for value against a passive opponent. It's really hard to make him fold. So when you make that min raise, you're really trying to hit your hand in order to get some value. And when you're out of position against a passive opponent, it's really a bit difficult to really play those hands profitably. So if you're going to raise, I would raise a little bit more to get that extra bit of fold equity. And you don't really mind when you're out of position with this hand to just take it down pre-flop. So you really should not be making all those min raises over the limps. Our opponent calls. It actually works out this time. We hit top pair, so we're definitely going to have to bet. You make a bet of 50% of the pot, which is great. In earlier hands, sometimes you bet a little bit too small, but here it's good. You just bet half the pot, and we do have top pair, but the board is relatively dangerous with some flush and straight possibilities. So betting 400 is good. We get a call. The turn is the king of clubs, and you check, but I think there's definitely some merit to making another bet because the king is really the only hand that we're worrying about, and you know the chances that he actually hit that king are not that high. So I think we just can make another value bet again here on a turn and get some value from our pair of nines here. But we check, and our opponent bets 1600. I would definitely fold here. There's no way that our hand is good here now. A passive opponent making such a strong bet, I don't see him do that with something like flush draw or straight draw, and in most cases he just has us beat. So I would just fold here, which you also do, so that's great. 10-4, you fold. Queen 6, just check that down, that's fine. King 9, you make a raise, that's good. With top pair, a 50% continuation bet, that's pretty standard, and our opponent folds. 6-7, that's a good call. It's a nice hand to play out of position. We flop bottom pair. It goes check, check. I like betting out here. We have a pair of sixes. We also pick up a 7-high flush draw. So there's a good chance that our hand is good here, and we want to get some value from our hand. Our opponent calls. The river is the deuce of spades, and you bet again. I think that's fine, especially against a passive opponent. There's still plenty of hands that he can call with here that are worse than ours, in particular a hand like 4x or deuce x, maybe even a hand like king high. But I quite like making a bet here. You could bet a little bit less maybe to not risk as much. So if you bet 400, maybe that's even better. It looks a bit face up if you bet such a small amount. But against such a passive player, he's not going to read anything into your bet sizes. So with 400, you really risk the minimum about what you're willing to invest with this sort of hand. And you invite a little bit more calls from weaker hands if you bet that small. So personally, I think a 400 bet would probably be a little bit better. And then your opponent min raises. That's really strange that he does that on the river, and I think we can be pretty positive that we're beat here, so I assume that we fold, and you do, which is a good fold, even though you get pretty good pot odds of 5-1. There's just no way against this particular opponent that we're good, I think. So you made a good fold. King deuce, you limp. And you haven't really been doing that all that much so far, but in general, I quite like it against this type of opponent because when your opponent is so passive, he's just going to call pre-flop a lot of the time, and you're going to have to play pots post-flop, and you're often going to have some trouble making him fold. So against these very passive opponents, it's actually quite a good strategy to limp more buttons when you're heads up. This is just a horrible flop, Jack 10 ace with 3 spades. Our hand is so weak. Even though it might still be good right now, our opponent could likely have a hand that has a decent amount of equity going to the turn and river with straight or flush draws. And when he bets 400, I think we just have to fold. We have a gut shot, but we're drawing to 3 queens really because the queen of spades, we can't really consider that an out. So we're really drawing thin here. And when a passive opponent bets pot on this kind of board, I think we're just going to lose the pot so often here if we continue. You do make the call, and I definitely wouldn't do that. I would just fold here against this opponent. The turn is the 9 of clubs, and again, when a passive opponent bets pot on the flop here, you can pretty much assume that he's going to keep firing on a turn and river, and our hand is just way too weak to be continuing here. So definitely fold the flop, and again, when he bets this on a turn, we should definitely fold, which you fortunately do. Queen 3, our opponent limps, and you shove all in. It really seems like a frustration move here. I mean, Queen 3 offsuit is definitely not good enough to be shoving here, and probably you just lost your patience, or maybe you got frustrated with the way that your opponent plays. But you should just check behind here or make a small raise, but shoving all in definitely isn't the optimal play here. 10 jack off, you min raise, that's good. You get a call. Your opponent bets 638 into 850, and again, when such a passive opponent just leads out on this ace-high flop, you can be sure that he has a pretty good hand. And we do have a gut shot, but I think it's way too weak to be able to continue in this hand. And against a more aggressive opponent, you can contemplate just calling here and trying to float in position and trying to take away the pot from him on a turn or river. But against a very passive opponent, you don't really have that opportunity because he's just going to keep firing on a turn and river. And even if he doesn't, you will have a very hard time making him fold. So, you have very little bluffing equity. So that means that you're going to have to rely on the strength of your hand alone more often. And with a gut shot only, that's not really going to be plus EV to continue in the hand here. But you actually shove, and I think that's a really clear mistake because you're going to see calls very often here from a passive opponent. And I assume that you make that raise here as a bluff, but trying to bluff passive opponents is very rarely going to be successful. If he's donk leading out of position on this type of board, you can pretty much guarantee that he's going to call you like 90 to 100% of time with a hand that has you crushed. So definitely just fold here and for sure not come over the top here with a shove all in. So I assume that you were getting a bit frustrated, you were losing your patience. But yeah, this is a clear mistake. And your opponent does call. And he had ace-jack, so he had you completely crushed there. So to recap this tournament, I saw some good things and some bad things. Overall, you played pretty well. But you have some specific leaks that you need to work on. So to recap, don't min-raise over limp so often. You're giving your opponents way too good of a pot odds to call behind, especially when you're in a relatively early position. Be more selective of the hands you play in the early stages. For example, I'm thinking of the ace-10 min raise over the limp that you did at 10-20 from relatively early position. These hands are too weak to be playing at these low blind levels, especially when your position is not that good and you already have a limp in front of you. Pay more attention to HUD stats and think about your opponent's ranges. I know that you are using a HUD, so also make use of the stats that you have. So for example, don't be calling Jack 5 offsuit out of position against a player who almost never raises. You really should be looking at his VPIP and pre-flop raise and kind of make assumptions on his hand range and go from there. And if you do use a HUD, also use those stats and think about what they mean and how you can use them to your advantage. Pay attention to bet sizing that you make. Sometimes you bet too small, so you're missing out on value and you're not protecting your hand enough. Especially be more aggressive in the later stages, especially when you are the chip leader in a tournament. You really need to be more aggressive, steal more pots, make more raises from the button and blind v blind. Particularly when there are some players at their table who are really showing that they are willing to give up their blinds when someone raises. So you really need to be more aggressive and pick up more pots in the later stages. And Also, work on your focus and patience. You made a couple of really big mistakes, especially in the later stages of the game, and it really seems that you are starting to lose your focus. You're not being really patient enough. Maybe you're thinking that, you came this far in a tournament and you just want it to be over. You just want to, once you're in the money, you feel, okay, I've done my job and I want to finish this tournament as soon as possible. But this is really the stage where you make most money. The later stage of the game, this is where the decisions are vital. This is where you make the most money. So you have to be on the top of your focus and your patience in the later stages of the game. It's much worse to be making these kinds of mistakes in the later stages than it is when you make these mistakes in the early stages of the game, because there's a lot less at stake at that point. So really work on that and try to improve your focus and patience. All right, that was it, and I really hope you got something out of this hand history review. If you really like these kinds of videos, leave a comment below, and I might be making more of these videos in the future. So good luck at the tables, guys, and see you in the next video.